Hey guys, and thank you for joining us today for another Cyber Talk with me, Julia Lee, Senior Manager of the Education and Center of Excellence Unit within the Cybersecurity Division of Ontario Public Service. Today, we're in a really special treat. We're a very exciting and innovative topic on the agenda. That is cybersecurity gamification. It's something that we at the Education and Center of Excellence have been really looking into as of lately, and it's something that's, I think, has been rumbling throughout the cybersecurity landscape. We're now seeing more of organizations using gamification in cybersecurity training in various ways to really educate their employees on the importance of cybersecurity and in a fun way, rather have it. Gamification itself, we've seen that it's been a game changer when it comes to employee satisfaction and training overall. And a recent survey study in 2019 from Talent LMS really goes to show that 89% of employees say gamification makes them feel more productive, and 88% says it makes them feel happier at work. But join with me today, without further ado, is Ali. He's the research and project lead at the AI Hub and Center of Cybersecurity Innovation at Durham College, with over 13 years of experience working on a variety of technology implementations in the government, academic, and reaching out to not-for-profit sectors. It's quite interesting today, as we probably know, and Ali, you've probably come across Ali through many platforms, moderating these panel discussions, but I have the pleasure today to interview him. As well, Ali has held senior roles in projects to enable remote connectivity, implementing technical trainings, bolster cybersecurity frameworks, and enhance access to mission-critical applications. He's also the perfect speaker to bring on to talk about today's topic of gamification. So let's get started. Welcome, Ali.
Thank you very much, Julia. And yeah, it's different being on this side of the fence, but it's also got me to appreciate how much preparation that speakers have to do, much more than what I have to do as a moderator. I really feed off their energy, so hopefully I can exude some of that today. So Julia, thank you for having me.
Great. Yes, I've got the easier task today. All right, let's kick things off as per usual with our first question on the line today. With gamification being a fairly new concept, how would you define gamification in cybersecurity, Ali?
Great question. So I think before sort of getting philosophical about it or even theoretical about it, I want to go through an analysis of how I look at gamification. And for me, gamification is, and probably I'm already going to get philosophical and theoretical about it, gamification is about the reintroduction of play into human learning. Now, some of you may have read this book by Paulo Freire. I'm dating myself here, but I remember studying under Professor Claudio Duran at York University when I was studying a course on the philosophy of education. And we read the book called The Pedagogy of the Oppressed. And he brought up this concept that Freire talked about a great deal, which is on the banking model of education versus a more open model of education where the teacher is also a learner. And the concept over here was we should focus on the teacher as a learner as well, moving away a little bit from that banking model of education, which is I'm the teacher, I'm going to teach you what the issues are or what you need to be looking for in a network breach, or what do you need to be looking for or doing in an incident response, and this is how you act and no other way. The other approach gets you to collaboratively work on how do you understand the situation and how do you play through it and come out to the other end and enjoy that process. See, we always talk about this concept of Ghana. So you really have to have that feeling and energy within you to sort of learn in this way. So for me, gamification is about the reintroduction of play into the ways in which we learn as human beings. Kids, especially when you look at the kindergartens and their formative years, learn through play, learn through make believe. Gamification in cybersecurity is exactly just that. Now let's look at some examples. You may turn around to me and say, but Ali, not everything can be taught in a playful circumstance, and not everything has to sort of be assigned players and have to have roles, etc. Sometimes you do need instruction. Key word here is I never said that we need to replace the models that we have in terms of having an instructor walking you through different scenarios, walking you through different situations. We need to augment it a little bit more different. And when you can augment instructions with gamification as well, A, research has indicated it helps learners stay more engaged, but B, it also gets us to realize that cybersecurity is a very complex environment to understand. And when the aim is not to make it simple, The aim is to make it more seamless. When you introduce gamification, when you introduce mechanisms via which you can role play, when you introduce mechanisms where which you simulate a situation and, for example, you get people to take on different roles and see different results based on the actions that they take, it makes the learning more seamless, makes it more integrated, and introduces play in a way which I think will allow more people to get engaged with cybersecurity training and, for one, help us address the talent deficit.
Most definitely. And I think just to add to the point there, Ali, I think games really it helps enable people to just practice and learn. And like you said, cybersecurity is very complex in terms of making sure that they hone into that knowledge through different scenarios and taking users through different scenarios on that end and making some of mundane tasks or tasks that are not as exciting, definitely more engaging and invoking more participation across the board. Ali, thanks for that explanation. But as we dive deeper into the idea of gamification in cybersecurity, there are many benefits in utilizing gamification that we just noted, but it's also we are seeing an increase in audience engagement and allowing for better information retention. But however, in your opinion, what's the importance of gamification in cybersecurity? How important is it really? And is it about engagement or consumption of new material, or is it really about giving awards and a whole point score?
So let's take it back a little bit, right? Excellent question, and I think that the definition that you suggested, which is cybersecurity gamification about consumption versus engagement, is critical. So first thing that I will say before stepping back a little bit is it well and truly is about engagement. Look, if we sit from a teaching pedagogy perspective, if we take the approach that we're going to award consumption, we are fooling ourselves. For example, if we're going to ask staff to get trained on cybersecurity techniques, and all we do is give them a set of PowerPoints to go through, and all we've done is basically said, yes, Ali Hirji has gone through those PowerPoints. Well, guess what? I'm going to write a script, click on each of those slides, get through all of those 60 slides, and suddenly I'm cyber aware. We need to move away from rewarding consumption. We've got to now focus on engagement. We've got to now look at ways in which we can ensure that people are engaged, people have learned, and we've made it seamless. We'll talk a bit more when I talk about examples, especially with cyber gamified, when I talk about different ways in which we've made this seamless. But now let's take another back step. When have I seen gamification come to the fore when it has come to changing behaviors or creating more learning situations? I might be getting my geography wrong, and I know if some of my students are on here, they will question most of my geography. Good that they're not live, so I'll take the liberty of using some of my geographical knowledge. I think it was in Sweden where they were trying to get lazy people like myself to take the stairs as opposed to the escalator. And what did they do? Instead of putting up signs to say take the escalator, it reduces heart disease by X%, research from smart scientists has shown this. What did they do? They took a flight of, I think it was 10 or 15 stairs, and I don't even know if this is a word, but they musicalized it. I know musicalized is not a word, but they introduced music into it, which is you would step on each stair, and it was painted to look like a piano key. You would step on each stair and it would make a sound. Suddenly, everybody wanted to take the damn stairs, because when you take the stairs, you get those sounds, and now different challenges started to emerge. If I run quickly up the stairs, what kind of sounds emerge? If I tap over one step and the other, and I dance around the stairs a little bit, what's going to happen? And people started making videos of this. You see, what happened over here, you wanted to move behavior in a particular way, but rather than banking upon them the idea, hey, this is good for you, you got them to engage in that process and made it kind of seamless. They're still going up the stairs, but the return and the reward on it is slightly different. Take that same philosophy and bring it now to cybersecurity. What is one of the biggest things that we hear a lot, whether it might be from executives as well? One of the things I hear a lot, and honestly, it does itch me when I hear executives, for example, tell me, I'm not a techie. Well, my friend, you're in a room with a pretty good machine there and a nice mic and some other IoT. You're pretty teched out. The problem or the point that they're trying to point towards is we're not really fluent or we're not really comfortable getting into the weeds of the tech. Because when we talk cybersecurity, when we talk, let's say, hey, there is, for example, the potential of cross-site scripting on our website, or hey, our firewalls may not have been augmented or positioned correctly, or hey, we do not have the appropriate mechanisms in place to protect from a DDoS attack, it takes you into this nervous island where you're unsure of yourself. What cybersecurity does, what gamification does, gets you comfortable to be a little uncomfortable. It gets you into this zone where, hey, we're just playing a game. And for example, now, if you take, for example, Cyber Gamified, which is a great example, essentially what it does is that it puts you in a role, it puts you in a situation with the appropriate fail-safes, but more importantly, there's not necessarily a wrong answer. You just continue through conversation. You continue through play. You might not be the best, you might not score the best points, but at the end of the day, you're engaging, you're having a little bit of fun. And what I think why it's so important to cybersecurity is that it's going to help us overcome some of those fears that executives may have, overcome some of those, the lack of time that some technical folks might have to engage in training. Look, I'll tell you straight up, if I get that 1 week or 2 weeks off during Christmas, I ain't looking to do training. I'm looking to go down in my basement and just watch Netflix. But if suddenly you can incorporate gaming into my learning, it allows me to make the time as well. For example, a lot of us play Cyber Gamified at 8 p.m. on Wednesday evenings, right? Because it's just fun to do. It's not necessarily like work. And then for those folks who are fearful to get into the space, do I know enough? Do I need to know about computers? It's a great introduction. I'll give you an example of doing some work with Contact North and Trish Trenter. She got many of her team members to start talking cyber by merely getting them to play one of those tabletop exercises. So for me, it's not just a nice to have, it's important now to have gamification in cybersecurity because it's going to help address the talent deficit, but more importantly, it's also going to break barriers to learning.
Absolutely. I have not partaken in those games yet, but I am very tempted now after you shared that, Ali. But in terms of just gamification in general, I find that, it's always, cybersecurity is always about thinking about outside the box, crystal ball gazing. But it also, gamification really brings to the forefront of bringing in new perspectives and fresh ideas that diversifies a group. And I think we'll get into diversity a little bit later in our chat today. But as we talked about the positives of using gamification in cybersecurity, I want to shift gears and let's play a little bit of a devil's advocate here. Do you see any challenges with implementing a gamification mandate around cyber training?
Yeah. So I'll argue that there are three major challenges. And I like the word that you use challenges as opposed to negatives. Challenges are there for a reason, and they're there for us to basically check ourselves before we wreck ourselves. But more importantly, challenges help us with also augmenting our process a little bit better. So I'll say one thing for sure is that if somebody's telling you that there are no challenges, just like risk, there are always going to be challenges, especially if you're thinking outside of the box and you are burning the box, for lack of a better word. Challenge number one, cost. To put together gamification scenarios, you either have to build them in-house or you have to partner with a third-party vendor. So let's say, for example, and because we're on their platform, I'll make mention of it. Let's say, for example, there are numerous gamification methodologies in cybersecurity. But let's say if you take Cyber Gamified as an example. If you use one of their tabletop scenarios, or you use, for example, their CAT simulation, which they're launching at the conference next week, if you work with those, remember, there are costs that come with it. These are not necessarily out-of-the-box SaaS-like models, plug and play. There are server costs that come with it, there are maintenance costs that come with it, costs that you may not necessarily have factored in. Especially where it becomes challenging, when you go from costs, you also go from a timeliness and delivery. If you look at gamification as a one-off thing, we're just going to do it once a quarter or something to that effect, you can probably just pay for it for that duration of time. But if you come from the school of thought, which is the Maverick school of thought such as mine, and you want to make it into a continuous process, then cost and continuity become two major challenges because there's maintenance on all of this. The maintenance on all of this ultimately requires you to not just factor in the cost to actually buy the servers or to have the servers and have the code, etc. Now you have to maintain all of this. Now, there are ways in which you can manage this, of course. In the case of Cyber Gamify, the different packages that they give you allow or loop in maintenance into it, but these are things we have to factor in. The third thing that I always see as a major challenge, and I'm not going to say uptake within the organizations, because sometimes I do believe that if as a leader you push things in a certain direction and you push the team towards seeing a particular way of doing things, kind of tend to fall in line or the conversations begin to emerge. But I'm not going to necessarily put upkeep or sort of upkeep within the team as a major challenge. It is one, but in my top three, the third challenge will be scenario generation. I've always been of the opinion, and I think you agree with me in this, is that there is no one size fits all solution when it comes to security. Each organization is faced with a very unique set of circumstances. Can your gamification provider provide you with multiple scenarios and libraries of different games? Probably. But again, goes back to looking at the cost and continuity. But let's say you're building these games internally. Now you do need to have a writer that can write the scripts to these games. You've got to have somebody who not only can write the scripts to the games, but somebody who's also attuned to what's happening in the world of security. So you need to have a little bit of a technical acumen to know what the most recent breach was all about. Let's say, for example, if we decide that we wanted to do something on Log4j, for example, or scripting in that nature, you have to kind of know where exactly in the JS code would you have seen this malicious property being implemented. So it is important that you have somebody that can actually write scenarios for you and breathes the oxygen and the culture of your company for these scenarios to be relevant. For me, those are the top three challenges. There are others, like I said. Will the team take it on? Will they continue to play? Will they see it as a challenge? Will some people say, you want me to play games during work time? Yeah, those are definitely challenges that will emerge, but not in my top three list of challenges.
And most definitely, there's definitely a lot of challenges, and it would be quite interesting to see. I haven't come across it before, just to see the inner workings, the behind the scenes work that really is involved in the game creations and
Yep,
the breaches and the case studies that's involved in the research, pretty much to execute a game of this scale.
absolutely.
Now that Ali, we worked through the pros and cons of gamification, let's move on now to some practical steps for someone who's interested in implementing or initiating that gamification programs within their organization. Can
Yeah.
you share maybe some of your experiences, expertise when initiating gamification programs for cyber, specifically how to develop games on a step-by-step basis to really ensure that the learning objectives are met?
Excellent. So there are, again, about 4 steps that I would recommend in this process. And they all fall under the brackets of people, process, and technology. The first thing that I would talk about, and I said 4 steps, although I mentioned 3 core PPT, 3 core guiding principles, 4 steps. The first step that you need to recognize is the people within your organization. Look, it's probably not going to be very useful if you create a cybersecurity game and ask, let's say, your CISSPs and your CEHs within your firm to play that game if all it does is basic, what is a DDoS attack? Or shows you what a DDoS attack. You're probably going to insult somebody's intelligence if you do that. So the first thing for me, the first step is know your people. Know what their learning levels are at, know what their contexts are. And this applies to if you've got somebody in finance who may not know much about cyber, you know where they rate from a learning perspective, where their knowledge is at. So you know what content to push at them. So number one, get a very good summary of the learning field of your people. What levels are they at when it comes to cybersecurity? This is definitely an intensive task. It involves a lot of involvement from your executives in security. It involves a lot of involvement from the HR teams as well, so that you can create modules that respect the professional context of each learner. That is number one, and goes back to my point of no one size fits all scenarios. Number two, and I said people, I talk about process. Process as a guiding framework takes me to point number two in terms of how do you get started. You need to figure out, do you want to run these games as cloud-based scenarios that people do on their own, or do you want to have it in a group-like setting? I have often favored gamification to run in group-like scenarios, which is what esports cyber kind of works with. But there are also things like, and I encourage you, Julia, to check it out at the conference, things like Minute Cyber from Minute School. They're going to be there at the conference as well. So when you're playing cyber gamified, you might also look at something like Minute Cyber to say, there are these group games that we must play, but then there's this continuous learning thing that we can do as well, which sends them a text, let's say a week after they play the games, and says, hey, we've got a couple of questions for you. Answer these to win 5 points or something to that effect. You need to know your process. I am a believer in triangulation. I am a believer in mixed methods. So I do suggest that you take group exercises and then you take some individual learning environments as well and marry them neatly together. But you need to understand that process. Remember, the vendors out there that can provide you these gamification scenarios, or if you build them on your own, those are available. The skill sets are available, the vendors are available. But if I take the vendors that I have in my direct reach right now, Gamified, it's Minute School, it's not that easy as to say, yeah, we're just going to do this gamification. If you're going to do group exercises, someone has to look at availabilities. Hey, if you're going to involve the SOC, who's monitoring the SOC when 4 people are out playing a game? You're going to have to look at timetables. You're going to have to look at schedules. You're going to have to look at lunches. I think those are coming back, post, dare I say, COVID. You're going to have to factor all of those things in to make it more enjoyable and fun. But at the same time, you don't want to be in a scenario where your process is once a quarter we'll play a game. We play a game, and then through the quarter, there's a little bit of reinforcement learning that's happening. And there's research to show that this all works very well when tied together neatly. The last thing, which takes me to my final 2 points, is the technology. So number one, there's often, which is point number three, there's often this idea that gamification is about I gotta wear this fancy headset and I gotta navigate a difficult space and I gotta pick some locks. That's not necessarily what gamification needs to be. The technology behind it will drive it a great deal, but don't get caught up in the fact that this has to be the equivalent of a PS5. It can be a very simple scenario where you even just have people dressed up in certain ways. I remember during the early days of running tabletop exercises, we ran certain games where people wore certain hats or wore certain costumes, and it added to the narrative. So for me, don't get too obsessed with just finding the technology. Don't just get too obsessed with saying, I want to find that gaming solution. 9 times out of 10, I find a lot of folks that go into gamification of cyber, they find the solution and then go searching for the problem. But that's the opposite way to do it. You need to know where do you strike that balance. Some learners are not that comfortable being with a joystick in front of their monitor. Some need it to be a little more hands-on. Maybe give them cards. Some people like to play games like Uno. So you gotta weave that into the conversation, the technology piece. The last part is that when you want to get started with this, is you've got to have champions within your organization. Like it or not, there have to be people there who are ambassadors of this process. Look, we've been doing this for a very long time. I started my career in Canada in 2008, and I still remember, and most of them were part-time gigs. And then in 2011, when I got my first gig as a development manager for Orion, and I was managing their software, one of the things that I started dealing with was very quickly, I started realizing the world of HR, where we had to do WSIB, we had to do this, that. Somebody was championing it. Every time I didn't do it, I got a message on our intranet saying, Ali, this isn't done. Somebody was championing it. Get it done, and telling me why it's important. You need to have some set of people within your team, not from the cyber instance alone, who are championing this whole idea of gamified-based learning for cyber. Those are the 4 things that I would argue are what you need to do in order to get started. And besides the obvious, you need to know your budgets. They don't need to be gargantuan budgets. It has to be respectful of the size of your organization. But if you manage your budgets well and effectively, you can achieve quite a lot through gamification mechanisms and cybersecurity training.
Thanks very much, Ali. That's very useful information and very valuable information, especially for our viewers today who are very keen. I think if you're tuning in around the gamification of cybersecurity, we're hearing that from the learning field to the playing field. For folks who are probably stuck at stage 1 of the consultation phase of understanding what the problem is, understanding who you are creating the games for, what kind of behavior you're trying to influence, did you have any further recommendations, Ali, for folks who might be stuck in that stage there where they're finding that it's quite challenging to understand the audience? We've seen gamifications through phishing campaigns or corporate phishing campaigns that organizations raise to really test the knowledge of users. But is there any other further advice that you'd like to share today?
2 things that I'll share in this regard, right? And it's very important, fundamental rule when you're trying to push a new activity or a new product or a new service is you need to know your audience, and you cannot be deaf, blind, and mute to what they are telling you. One of the things that I often say when it comes to if you're stuck with where do you get started with your audience is talk to other groups that have implemented these kind of gamification like models. At Beyond Borders conference run by CyberX, I had the honor of doing a session with the folks that were running Cyber Jitsu and Wicked Games out in the US. Their names defeat me, but two wonderful ladies that were leading this initiative. And what they were talking to me about was they had a very clear sense of who their audience is. Yes, they were looking at diverse groups, but folks that were in the technical world that wanted to get involved a little bit more in playing some games related to the crafts that they're most familiar with. How did they learn about this? Well, they had conversations with people. They attended different conferences. But more importantly, one of the things that you can do well is actually survey your audience. Know what they feel, what they need to know, get a sense from them in terms of what they feel is lacking, engage them. That for me is one of the simplest ways in which you can begin to understand where your audience is at and what you're trying to achieve. Number two, you have to take into account is what I'm doing, is it private just to my institution, or am I looking to launch something that's public? Now, when you look at, for example, games like Cyber Olympics, you look at Wicked Games, you look at all of these, loosely I'm going to call them these hackathons. They're all geared towards a very public environment. Now, what you have to recognize is that in these kind of public settings, it's not just the game alone. It's the branding that goes with it. It's the awards that go with it. It's the recognition that goes with it as well. This is why I keep saying that it's very easy for groups to say, we're going to run a hackathon. Great. If I win it, I get $1,000. Great. What else? You have to realize that these games have to get a little bit of an factor in them. Right now, I watch a lot of cricket. And right now, on another screen, I also have the Indian Premier League that's playing because my favorite teams are playing right now. Why do I watch the Indian Premier League so much? Well, capitalism. It's been pushed at me at a very young age, and who can when there's Bollywood and drama and cricket together, I watch it. But this is an important point. When people go to hacking competitions, it's not just about, oh, let's go and learn to hack or let's go and test our skills. There's branding around it. You got to know how to put on a show together. One of the reasons why I give a huge shout out to the team at CyberX, when we ran pre-COVID, we ran the Global Cyber Olympics Games. We didn't have a grand facility. And for those of you that are interested, we can send you some shots of that event. But what did they do very well? They took a nice auditorium, put in some nice RGB lights, not the little ones that I have, nice RGB lights in there, created good branding around it, created value around the awards, tied it in with the municipalities, and suddenly there was attention to these games. Remember, some audience members are not playing these games because they want to show you that they can hack. Some of them are trying to get to their next job. Some of them are trying to increase the amounts that they charge from a consulting perspective. People are motivated by different factors. And it's very important that if you're going to run these scenarios and you're going to do it from a public perspective, for example, you got to look at the show personship. This is where platforms like Cyber Exchange, events like Women in Cyber that's coming up, you look at Collision for that matter. It's doing the same thing. It's bringing people together, but it's motivating them differently. It's creating I wouldn't use the word tribe, and I've learned this. I'll just make this comment. I read this from an indigenous elder that using the word tribe can have not so pleasant connotations. So I would recommend to folks not to use the word tribe. And this is a teaching and a learning moment, of course. But what is super important is, for example, I'm rallying behind the We Are Cyber movement. Many of us rally behind the movements around Collision because something has been created, a group has been created, a movement has been created. So you have to think about how we're going to market this, how are we going to brand this, how are we going to create that show personship around it. It's all part of the gaming experience.
Absolutely. And my team here on the education side, we are always working on creating interactive, engaging content for all of our materials. We're making sure that it's diverse enough and it reaches the widest audience in the net possible. But we do take things into account when you're talking about diversity and so forth is age. What's the culture we're facing? What's the race? What's the language? And much more. So a question that we usually often find ourselves asking ourselves is, how are these interactive games and activities, how can they be used to attract really a broader demographic of staff within an organization to really engage in topics that we see as such as IT, cyber hygiene, and tools and programs? So Ali, my question for you now is, what are some opportunities for people to experience gamification in cyber? And in what ways can gamifying cyber really create a more diverse and an inclusive platform?
Excellent. With your permission, I'll deal with the second part of your question first on the diversity, inclusion, and
Sure.
equity component. I go back to the session that I did at Beyond Borders, and one of the things that the audience there spoke about, and even the crew at Human, who are going to be at the Women in Cyber, they work with Phelps and the separate cybersecurity recruitment arm. In one of their sessions as well, they talked about the fact that, look, diversity, and I've said this before, is not just about skill, it's about thought, it's about talent, it's not just about race and ethnicity. But then I learned about the concept of neurodiversity as well. People are different types of learners. People get stimulated in different ways. And one of the things that when I was doing the Beyond Borders session that my guests, Mary Galloway, I believe her name was, and Jessica, and I know that session is on demand on Cyber Exchange, one of the things that they talked about was because these games are played in different ways, sometimes you need to pick locks, sometimes you've got to work with a joystick and navigate yourself around things. It allows people to address a problem in different ways. Sometimes, for example, I'll speak about myself. If you ask me to talk about a topic in depth, I can do it on demand, impromptu. I feel comfortable to talk impromptu, and that's just how I am tuned. But if you ask me to sit down and write it and coin it and pen, it can be very difficult. Now, I have tried from a personal perspective to start to improve my writing. When, for example, I do LinkedIn posts, I take a little bit of time and compose a little bit of a statement. When I do Instagram posts, I compose a little bit of a statement. But it helped me identify the fact that I'm more comfortable from an oratory perspective than I am from a written perspective. So when I deliver trainings, I have somebody else take care of the examination component. I take care of the oratory part of it. I take care of the engagement side of it in real time and deal with those impromptu questions. So for me, one of the things that happens with these games is because there are multiple paths or multiple roads to the castle, you can then try different things as a learner. And this brings out, for example, neurodiversity in the whole equation. I know I've given this example quite a bit, but I'll beat this horse once more. And that is, when we ran Cyber Olympics, and I made mention of this, and some of the teams, when I went to speak to them, not everybody was a computer major, a computer science major. I had a couple of people in philosophy, a couple of people in communications, like myself, who are self-taught. These games bring that out. But there's another thing that also comes out in these games, and that is when you look at it from an identity perspective. Games and gamers have for a period of time had a bit of a negative connotation. Now, I'm talking about growing up in Dubai, where we would have only like a day for 2 hours on a Friday because that was our weekend then, that was our Sunday then, where you could play Nintendo or Pegasus, and I'm dating myself. Yes, and Atari as well, and you could play that, right? And there was this negative connotation around games because it was not, you're not going out and playing, you're playing from the screen, blah, blah, blah. That's changed over a period of time where now, for example, at DC, during college, we have an entire center dedicated to esports, and they have better computers than my labs because now there's competition that's been introduced. The culture is changing, the identities of gamers are changing. And this has allowed now for more fluidity in the space. I've been noticing, for example, females, males, non-binary folks who play games are now coming out to these competitions. It's bringing out different identities. I think what was really, really nice for me to watch was at Wicked Games, Dr. Reem from Kuwait, I believe, who is a Muslim lady, wears a full hijab and an all-out gamer, right? Excellent to look. If you look at in Pakistan, for example, I've noticed some gamers who go into hacking competitions, dressed in traditional clothing, in the hijab, etc. But you know what? It's bringing them out now because there's this uniqueness of, whoa, look at these competitions. And now these individuals who are often sidelined are coming out and showcasing some of their skills. Absolutely important. More and more diversity is coming out from a representation perspective. If I even look at the countries that are coming out to these competitions, if I look at the age brackets that are coming out to these competitions, there's still work to be done to get folks sort of my age, 35 pluses, to start getting them to come out to these competitions as well. But you're beginning to see those barriers are breaking, and games and gamification is kind of making a lot of that possible. We say it's all fun and games. Yeah, it is fun and games, and people come out to these things. So I feel like the culture around gaming, the culture around the hackathons, the culture around these capture the flags, etc., the branding that's put around it is helping attract more diverse interest, and that can only get better provided we continue to market these games and these scenarios more effectively. Now, to the first part of your question, which I hope the limited brain cells that I don't remember, is the aspect of how exactly, for example, you choose where to get started from, but more importantly, how can these games actually evolve over a period of time, and where can you go to actually get started with gamification? Well, there are a couple of places. The first place that you need to go to really appreciate and understand gamification is yourself. You need to take the time. This is not something that, oh, that's gamification. Yes, walk this way for gamification. You need to take a few moments, check yourself to learn about, well, what is it, what's happening in the market. Go on to Google, type up what is gamification and learning. What do you mean by awards? What do you mean by badging? What do you mean by micro-credential? Take some time first to get to know what these terms are. There is no door somewhere that says enter here for gamification. That's number one. All right. I'll make the argument that when we go to the conference next week and we download, let's say, the Cyber Exchange app, that's a form of gamification. Because guess what? I have the highest number of points on that platform, and when I hit 5,000 points, I'm getting something from the vault. That's gamification too. So number one, research it a bit. Number two, conferences. Absolutely. We have one coming up next week. We have a couple of others that are coming up through the summer. PSN does some great conferences. I know we have Sector. There will be organizations there doing some forms of gamification. That's the best way to get hands-on exposure. You've got to invest in these things. All of us are busy, but as Julia once you had mentioned, not just about being busy, it's about being effective. These conferences help us being effective. We don't sit on these boards just because we want our pictures plastered everywhere. It helps us being more effective. Go to these conferences. If budget is an issue to go to these conferences, have a word with the conference organizers. One thing I want to give a shout out to Maddie and his team. When I've come forward and said, some students need some assistance, they've come forward. That's important. That's why we partner on these conferences. Number three, I do recommend getting in touch with Cyber Gamified, getting in touch with other vendors as well. But I would suggest that if you have the opportunity to, if you really want to get to experience what all of this is about, book a ticket going to one of these cybersecurity games, live gaming competitions that happen, whether it's Hacker Halted, whether it's Def, whatever it is that you can get to, try to go to them so that you can experience what is happening in these games. And then eventually there are always booths where you can test out and trial a lot of games. That's what I would recommend. And again, there is an investment that's required. It's good to know the price of everything. It's about time we also appreciate the value of things as well.
Most definitely, and we're hearing loud and clear here. It's a win-win situation for those who are participating in the games and those organizations who are thinking about adding a bit more effort, time, or funding to make sure that there is games available or these challenges for staff, really opening up the discussions, thinking out of the box and preventing any exclusive behavior issues is where we see, most of the benefits of gamifications. Thanks so much, Ali, for much insight into gamification. Now we're going to switch gears for the audience to know a little bit more about you. What got you into the cybersecurity space, and what does the future hold?
Excellent question, and I've made this very clear every time I've spoken that I did not go to school to study security, and I dropped out of IT in the first week. Self-taught in a lot of this, but one of my biggest challenges growing up was I enjoyed being in front of the public. I struggled with communicating. I either got very emotional, I either got aggressive, or I either got very passive. And thanks to my parents, I made the decision to shift and study communications at York, and then I went into sociology and other disciplines, but maintained my love for IT at the same time. And that's how I sort of balanced the two together. I got involved in this space in 2017 when I was working at Orion. And we had put together the shared CISO program. I always was interested in security. I always understood the fundamentals of security, but I never got to apply it. I never got to get into the practical world of it. That was my first opportunity. At the time, the CISO there was Farouk, who's now offshore working on some exciting projects. I got to work with him. And then I got to work with other respectful CIOs across the industries, Luke Roy, who's on our board as well. I got to work with people like Galen Gray at McMaster and started building programming. That's when I got involved more into the technical side of it, and then started getting involved into the awareness and training programs. So for me, that seminal moment for me when I really got involved with it hands-on was during my career at Orion. Always was interested in the space, always beyond just your traditional firewalls and your antivirus. I was always interested in what are some of these loopholes that exist in system, how are these vulnerabilities found, etc. I was doing port scans in some shape or fashion, learning as I go along, demoing certain attacks, doing simulations. But that was the first time that I really got involved in it from a programmatic perspective and from a work perspective. And it basically puts food on my plate. Now, in terms of what I see going ahead into the future, there are two things that I see which I think are going to be very important to us. Number one is I'm very keen to see where developments land with the metaverse. And the reason I say this is the metaverse addresses one of society's or one of human civilization's greatest flaws, and that is we sleep. So there's a period of time of inactivity. The metaverse, if geared with AI data or AI powered knowledge of studying our behaviors, will be a place where we will have avatars that are working on behalf of us as us in the metaverse. The time is not too far away where you and I might be talking about, hey, Julia, let's meet up. And your question is, you want to meet up in the universe or the metaverse? And that might become common speak for us. I feel that this 25/7 lifestyle is going to trigger a very new set of new normal in the world of security. And what I mean by this is I borrow from the former CISO of City of Toronto, Kush Sharma, where he said, just like we have health insurance and we see it as a right, cyber insurance for each individual might become a very, very real thing. So that's number one that I see. Number two, I think we're going to see a very interesting shift in the way talent is sought for in the world of cybersecurity. And I think one of the things that we're forgetting, one of the things that's going to become very prominent in our cybersecurity training is language. I think language is knowing how to speak different languages, knowing how to code in different languages, but more importantly, knowing how to understand context in different languages and cultures is going to be critical. So going forward, I do see more exchange programs emerging. I do see more programs emerging where cybersecurity programs might actually bring in more of the arts. And I also see a very neat marriage of SOCs that may develop as international collaborations between different nation states. There are other things as well. I can definitely comment on the threat landscape and how it's going to evolve, so on and so forth. But for me, if I had to pick two, not necessarily my top two, it would be the developments in the metaverse, and number two, the ways in which we might be introducing the arts into our cybersecurity training programs.
It's very interesting. I'm very curious to see how that's kind of developed, and especially for you and your role being in the higher education space. But let's just take it back a few notches at the beginning where you're saying you had some challenges on communications. We would have never have probably thought that, and I think maybe our viewers today could probably attest to that, Ali. But it's really an interesting background that you have, really dispelling and just kind of breaking the myths or the stereotypes that you need to have a cybersecurity background in order to get into the cybersecurity field. And I think you definitely challenged that in a great way to say you are self-taught. You've had your challenges in communications. You've shifted gears now to more of the education and awareness piece, which shows that there's so many opportunities and diversification in cybersecurity alone in terms of job opportunities, but as well as when you're in the education realm. And that's what I love about my job here is the flexibility and the creativity that we can bring to the table. And there's really no barriers, right? That you're not putting everything into a square box of your program. You can pretty much bring it to kind of any level, just by understanding, who the audience is ahead, what's the problem that you're trying to solve, and start executing the issues.
Absolutely. I've always believed that it's, people talk about these things called soft skills. I think it's essential skills. And we do need those essential skills. We need security folks who can communicate and project management well as well. So yeah, thank you for that though. Appreciate it.
All right, so to that end, I do have one last question for you before we get to the questions from our audience today is, what is the best cybersecurity advice you can give or have ever received?
Yeah, I'll take the one that, because I really don't have much to give, but I can definitely talk about what I've received. And this was from my friend out at Waterloo Hydro, who's also running Cyber Gamified and will be at the conference next week, Mark Dillon. And I know this is a quote that you can find on the internet, very common, and he says that we were working through a system and he said, Ali, I told you, don't trust a computer that you can't throw out of the window. And he wasn't telling me that, abandon cloud computing completely, but what he was talking to me about is visibility. And visibility, as I mentioned in a tweet last week, doesn't necessarily mean transparency. Visibility requires you to know the inner workings of your operations like a hawk. And you need to be very clear in how you manage your vendors. You need to understand their process. You need to ask questions. So for me, that statement, which he reminded me of, is never trust a computer that you cannot throw out the window, basically reminded me that cybersecurity is about, yes, it's about vision and it's about transparency. And as leaders in this space, or at least aspiring leaders in this space, you don't just trust a service randomly. Even if it's a cloud architecture that you're deploying, you need to have maximum visibility and transparency into it, and you need to know how to ask the right questions. Otherwise, when that incident happens, you're like, well, we have 24/7 incident support, but yeah, it doesn't cover this piece and that. Well, I didn't know that. Kind of too late to ask that question at that time. So that for me is one piece of advice from my wise sage friend Mark Dillon that I would share with your audience today.
That's actually a wonderful piece of advice there. Definitely asking the right questions is always helpful, especially within our field here. And what I usually like to share with my students or folks who are new to the cyber team, take the I don't know out and replace it with let me find out. Let me, do a little bit better in terms of research, digging, and finding the right questions to prevent that issue from happening. And that's definitely some, one of the key takeaways on my side here that I remember some from my mentors that they've trickled down to me in terms of, taking away for the I'm not sure, I don't know, eliminate that. All right, Ali, thanks very much. And I think it's time. I'm seeing the questions rolling through live. Let's go on and move over to our Q&A.
Sure.
Our first question here is for you, Ali. Are you seeing K-12 students interested in gaming?
Yeah, great question. Definitely seeing teachers that are looking to adopt some of these scenarios. I'm seeing more teachers come out to our sessions, more teachers reach out. I'm curious to see how many teachers in the K-12 are coming out to the conference next week as well. Definitely seeing more interest in cybersecurity amongst the teachers. Not so much when it comes to gaming, but at the same time, I'm not the best person to talk about in the K-12 sector whether they're adopting more gamification-like models. I'm definitely seeing an interest amongst teachers when it comes to security knowledge and awareness. Now, for students and interest in gaming, absolutely. It sort of comes second nature, especially driven by the technologies that we are surrounded by, that they have an inkling and an inclination towards gaming, an inclination towards gamified learning. I think that is only going to increase. I do recommend that when you are at Women in Cyber, I think Connects Health is going to be showcasing a product called Key to Enable, and it's about how to get folks who have intellectual learning challenges to improve their motor skills, for example. So I do feel that I'm seeing a definite interest by default in the students in gamified-like scenarios, gamified-like learning. And when you look at, for example, the robotics competitions that we have across Canada, and I look at, for example, some of these very short and small CTFs, or Cyber Titan that's run out with ICTC, definitely seeing very good enrollment in those environments. So both objectively and subjectively, I would say yes, I am seeing an increase of interest in gamified learning and gamified experiences.
Absolutely. And just on our side here from the Center of Excellence, we were being hearing from the sector as well that not just the teachers, but some students and board members as well are really excited to look into gamifications, of course, to capture the kind of attention span for that age group as well. And they're the first wave of learners, right? We want to get them on board. We want to make sure that cybersecurity is a fun thing for them to learn and implement from for their personal lives to school at that age. And we've tried to kind of implement that a little bit with a sneak peek in last year's in our education awareness program through introducing to the sector cyber comics and cyber novels so they can relate to various scenarios of, how a phishing attack unfolds or just, clicking on the wrong link on a social media post, which is quite relatable to the K to 12. But
I agree. Great points.
yep, moving on to our next question, Ali. Can you please share over any effective badging strategies?
Very good question, and a technical one to a degree. I know we have about 5 minutes, so I'll try to race through this. But to the audience member that asked us, feel free to message me as well. So there are two things that I look at when it comes to badging strategies. Number one is, are you creating levels? So what do I mean by that? Is there, with the different badges, are you moving up and moving up a hierarchy? Or is it just sort of a horizontal playing field where you just got different badges and it doesn't really mean anything? It's just that you've got different badges means you've completed certain things. Doesn't necessarily place you between one person or the other. So the first thing that I'll talk about is, when I said levels, I basically mean ranking. If you're going to do a ranking system with your badging, then you need to have an effective leaderboard, and you need to know how to broadcast that leaderboard to the members that are playing that game. I look at Cyber Exchange, for example, and if you hit certain points, you get a badge. And the objective is that as you start moving up, and I know in their future releases, they tend to show you who has the most points, etc. As that continues, you get certain things and certain rewards. So an effective badging strategy really is, if you're going to put in ranking, then you've got to attach it to prizes, you've got to attach it to some sort of giveaways. Number two, in terms of a badging strategy, critical to get your marketing teams involved in that. I don't have much of a marketing brain, but one of the things that I look at when I do these kind of programs is, what are we going to call the different badges? Like, for example, on Cyber Exchange, you have the Bit Flipper, for example, right? Interesting. These are the kind of things that you have to come up with. You've got to come up with these interesting names. You've got to come up with these interesting titles. You've got to put on, bad example, but you've got to put on a little bit of your WWF hat on. And what are the different moves, etc. You're going to have to brand it in a certain way. So for me, those are two things that I can reflect on when it comes to badging.
Great. I know we were just a little bit over time, but we've got one more question if you're okay, Ali. What are some examples of gaming assessment scenarios, and does gaming really assist with incident response?
So number one, please, if you haven't at Women in Cyber, please sign up to play one of those games. I know seats are limited. Play it because you will see what gamification for specific scenarios look like. Number two, can it help with incident response? So I'll summarize my response to this very, very clearly. Absolutely, it can. You see, these games, what they do is they create mock scenarios. They create mock simulations. So whether it's a situation where, let's say, all of your monitoring screens are down, or a situation where, let's say, your core environment is your core production environment is down, and now you need to stand up a new environment, but you're unable to. It's basically looking and walking you through a live breach, and then you're responding to that incident. Most of the tabletop games that I've played really focus around this, but in the gamified world, especially with the Cyber Gamified, for example, and I've played 2 versions of the game already, what you see happening is, and on demand, you'll also see the CISO forum game. What you see happening is that in real time, you're making decisions, and you roll your dice, and your decision goes one way or the other. So that's what makes it very real. I might be in a situation where it's Friday afternoon before a long weekend, everybody's out partying, but Julia's the only security person working there really, really hard. And I know what needs to be done. Let's say we need to go and reset, pull out our backups and implement our backup scenarios to get ourselves back alive. But guess what? I rolled the dice, and it turns out the person that I wanted to actually turn the backups on is on vacation today. That then opens up a learning moment where we talk about who's filling in for whom in such mission critical roles. That for me is the way in which we respond to how incident response can be taught through gamified scenarios. And I think though that was the last question, Julia, I'll take a minute and just make one more comment as well when it comes to gamification. I think the onus now is also on us when we look at cultures of play. At the start of my sessions, I often talk about the fact that we need to recognize that learning techniques are not just secluded to Western models of how we learn. I know I quoted Paulo Freire, which is from Latin America. We need to start now engaging with our indigenous communities and our indigenous elders, especially when it comes to techniques of learning from the land. I'm talking about from a pedagogical perspective, there are things that we can introduce to our learning and our gamified behaviors that I think will be very useful for us. One of the things that I'm hoping to start, and this is something that I hope to speak to the advisory board with, is on how can we engage some indigenous elders, especially indigenous teachers, and helping us build some cybersecurity learning circles as well. So I just wanted to make that point known, and I know we're at the top of the hour. So Julia, back to you.
Thanks very much, Ali. Yeah, I think today we've really talked about the pros, we talked about the cons, we talked about diversity that has its benefits, just through all levels and different roles of the organization up the chain, but also expanding it out to different age groups. We talked about teaching real life skills through gamifications and how that benefits the organization and the player at hand, and attracting a broader demographic most important, I think, in this
Yeah.
scenario here. And also for folks who are initiating the games, be your own game master. Control the experience for users to better fit yourself in a way to have a better understanding of what's at play.
Excellent points.
Again, Ali, thank you very much for your insights today. Very happy to have you on board for the past hour, and especially to you guys who are tuning in and joining us and spending your last hour to hear all about gamifications. If you like the session, be sure to come back for next month's session where we'll be having a lineup of cybersecurity topics and having a new guest on each time. But in the meantime, Ali and I wish you to stay cyber safe and see you next time. And for those who are joining our Canadian Women in Cybersecurity Conference next week on May 4th to 5th, hope to see you there, where Ali and I will be sure to have a battle or two of the games live in person.
Sounds good. Thank you very much for having me, Julia.
Thanks, everybody, and take care. Bye-bye now.
Bye.